Ray Salmon was 65 years old when he vanished on the 9th of June 2013 from the shores of Harrison Lake in Fraser Valley of British Columbia, Canada. Unfortunately, as is often the case with almost all of the disappearances discussed on this channel, Ray chose one of the worst possible locations he could have to vanish from. This was a very remote area. There wasn't any real civilization in the immediate proximity, no homes, just a large lake, dense forestry and wilderness. Though from Ray's perspective, none of that was really a problem for him. He had not only been to this area, but from what I'm able to ascertain, he'd been to pretty much this exact spot over 20 times over a 20-year period. So for him, this was practically just another Tuesday. He had gained an intense familiarity with this area over those years. Usually, Ray would come out to these remote locations with his wife, Daniela, and they would stay together. Sadly this time, he would disappear so thoroughly as to never be seen again while at this camp by himself without anyone else but his two dogs, Elmer and Bandit, his truck, his camper and his raft. Ray grew up in northern Ontario and was constantly out in the woods where he learned all of his outdoorsman skills. He was an avid camper, a fisherman and a hunter. Ray was a man of true experience in all of these areas and had been doing this for his entire life. He was one of those people that just had fantastic common sense in these areas, which undoubtedly was due to the knowledge passed down to him and his love of the outdoors he spent so much time in. All of these factors perhaps just make it all the more bizarre that somehow this man disappeared in the way that he did. 10 years have come and gone since that time, and still it is not known what happened to him. As you'll come to see, there is a possibility that the authorities may have known more than they were willing to let on. But for whatever reason they had, it does seem that they didn't want to clue in the public, or even the searchers weirdly. Perhaps because of how odd the whole incident was. Or they just weren't able to confirm any suspicions that they might have held privately. Now, on the 7th of June, 2 days prior to his disappearance, Ray drove down to Harrison Lake with his two dogs from his home. He came prepared for this, and with the equipment he brought, he was clearly expecting to camp there very comfortably. As well as his two best companions, as said, he had the camper, he had a fridge, an air conditioner, a furnace, hunting equipment, and so obviously the means of defending himself. His prep also extended to the water. As said, he had his raft, which was equipped with a motor, and he had a complete life jacket. Ray was a man that knew how to prepare and how to stay safe in these kinds of areas. So it really does seem as though something truly must have gone terribly wrong. What that event may have been is not known. Ray didn't actually plan to be alone for the entire time. After heading out on the 7th, which was a Friday, he had planned to come back to town to pick up one of his best friends, John Miles, on the Monday, which would have been the 10th. The pair had planned to hang out and explore old abandoned mines together, but sadly, this meetup would never take place. On Sunday afternoon, the day before John was set to join Ray, John was out working on a truck and said that he'd heard someone ejecting 3 shells in the forest, which came from the general area that Ray's camp would have been. Police investigating complaints of shots fired stumble into mystery off West Harrison Forest Service Road. Police in the Fraser Valley are asking the public to help them find a Vancouver man who appears to have gone missing from a remote campsite off Harrison Lake. On Sunday, Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers were investigating the complaints when they happened upon the seemingly abandoned campsite. What was particularly interesting about this was the nature of these shots. The reason the Royal Canadian Mounted Police got involved right at the start here was that a number of young people rushed to the police stating that the 3 shots heard earlier had been directed at their car. I believe both of the headlights had been struck. I'm not sure if it was ever confirmed as an absolute that this was Ray that did that, but I do believe that it was assumed to be related based on what people were saying. But that's strange. Ray was a responsible hunter. He knew how to handle himself and his equipment with care. So if that was Ray, what was going on? What could have possessed him to target a vehicle like that? Was he spooked for some reason? I can't imagine that was an attempt to call for help, as he knew to eject towards the sky if he needed assistance, and not randomly at someone's vehicle where someone could have been badly hurt or worse. Could he have been aiming at something else entirely, and that was an accident? It seems that there is far more to this story than just a man getting lost in the woods. Something happened, a set of circumstances that are not obvious. Also, because the headlights had been destroyed, I am assuming it was somewhat dark at the time and they must have been switched on for Ray or whoever else to have seen them. So what does that insinuate? If it was Ray, was he associating the bright lights with a threat? We're in total speculation land, obviously, but could that mean that there may have been a separate source of light initially that he believed posed a threat to him, and then later mistook the headlights as this potentially perceived threat? Police say that so far they have been unable to find the 65-year-old. Search and rescue and a Royal Canadian Mounted Police helicopter crew have been searching since Monday. An RCMP corporal said, "We are concerned for Mr. Salmon's safety. This is a wilderness area with no formal campsites. This area is frequented by campers. We believe that he has been at this campsite since May 28th. The corporal said there is no reason to believe the complaint about shots fired is connected to Salmon or his mysterious disappearance." I'm not entirely sure what the date of the 28th of May was referring to. As far as I can tell, Ray headed up there on the 7th of June that year. Though perhaps the spot itself might have been something that Ray tended to and just kept something set up there. Or he'd set up shop initially on the 28th and then came back home to resupply. I'm not really sure on that. It's also interesting that the statement given was that there was no reason to believe that Ray and the 3 shots were connected. I say this because during the search for Ray, they had fully armed squadrons searching the forest for him. So clearly, that can't have been the complete truth there. Privately, they must have been associating the 2 events to some degree. Now, that's not to say they believed that Ray was the one who took the shots, but they had a missing man in the woods under these odd circumstances. Perhaps they believed that there was an aggressive presence in the area. None of that was ever really made clear, and they kept tight-lipped about it. The way that Ray was reported as missing was quite atypical too. Daniela stated that she got a knock on the door, and when she answered, there was an officer outside. The officer asked if Ray was home, and she said no, and then posed some return questions of her own. Such as, is something wrong, and why are you asking me that? She stated that this officer was brief and didn't really have many details to give her as to what was going on. Afterwards, she called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were also brief, and told her that they believed Ray was missing. All I can really assume here is that after the young people in the car experienced what they had with their headlights and then they went down to the authorities, officers came and discovered Ray's campsite abandoned, and they must have found his information inside the camper, and then when they couldn't locate him, called him in as missing themselves. Even though Daniela knew how weird this was right off the bat, she wasn't too worried initially, because she knew just how skilled Ray was in the outdoors. And she knew that he knew to stay put and allow the searchers to come to him. Her first thought was that he might just have suffered an injury and was now sat beneath a tree or something similar, just waiting to be discovered. However, as time went on, this began to look like it wasn't the case at all. The search for a Vancouver senior whose abandoned campsite was found after sounds of shots rang out near Harrison Lake last weekend is growing more desperate. Raymond's camp was discovered by Mounties, responding to a call of shots fired at a remote area roughly 50 kilometres up the West Harrison Forestry Service Road Sunday night. Officers found Salmon's 2 beloved dogs in his camper, but there was no sign of the 65-year-old. Search crews have been scouring the area since Monday to no avail, and the avid camper's wife is growing anxious to hear good news. This was another sign that something terribly wrong had taken place. Ray loved those dogs, and if he was going on a hike, they would have been right there beside him. Instead, the dogs were locked inside the camper. So why would Ray exit the camper and then lock the dogs inside? I can only imagine that action was taken for their own safety. Again, did Ray believe that there was a threat present, and what might this threat have looked like? There was no evidence of animal predation nor that of foul play. The only clues were the 3 shots, though there was no further context discovered surrounding them in terms of why they happened. Speaking of which, there was a graduation party consisting of around 50 people that was taking place not too far from where Ray was camping, and I don't know this for certain, but I believe the car whose headlights were struck may have belonged to someone either going to or from the party. The people at the party had left a lot of trash behind, and weirdly, when the professional search and rescue teams arrived, instead of placing these expert trackers inside the forest to help them find Ray, instead, these searchers were told to clean up the trash. A number of the searchers called in had a lot of experience in this particular location too, so you'd have thought they might have been put to better use in helping to find Ray. When the searchers did arrive though, they noted the truck, the camper, and that all of Ray's belongings were laid out under the tarp and everything looked well maintained. Again, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had noted that both the truck and camper were locked with both of the dogs inside the camper, but no one else was around. After being told this, it seems that Daniela did not believe that Ray would have been on a hike at the time, otherwise the dogs would have been with him. Hiking was quite literally one of the reasons he had them in the first place. He loved their company and taking them on walks. It's not clear at all why the dogs had been locked inside. I won't reiterate too much with that, other than stating the only conclusion I can reach was that Ray may have felt that there was a danger of some kind nearby. But if that was the case, then why wasn't he also in the camper? Unless this was a threat that he didn't believe the camper was enough to defend against. I say that because if it was the presence of a bear or some other kind of predator passing by, it seems to me that he would have been in the camper with them, waiting for whatever it was to leave. This didn't happen. One of the searchers stated this: "It was the strangest thing. I have never showed up to a search where we had full emergency response team members. Some guys had fully autos, and I remember it very specifically because I've never showed up to a search where we're searching alongside emergency response team members." So, I suppose one question that might be asked right off the bat would be, why was there a fully armed SWAT team presence at the site? This is odd to some extent since they were searching for a missing person, and it's not clear if they had a suspicion that they just weren't sharing. However, I can only imagine that after the incident with the car whose headlights had been destroyed, perhaps the authorities were just being careful and assumed that whoever did that may have meant harm to others. The searchers themselves knew that something was wrong with all of this, and they did think that these events were odd. And you can see why. You have professional search and rescuers arrive at the scene. These are the kind of people that know exactly what they're doing. They have tons of experience and many are great trackers. The search dog handlers know how to get the best out of the dogs, and instead of making them an integral part of the search right away, they're made to clean up garbage while sending fully armed squads into the woods. What were they expecting to have happen or find in the woods? Some kind of potential conflict or standoff or what? That's all you can really conclude with that, but it's interesting that they didn't specifically tell the searchers this. It's all these mysteries. My mind keeps thinking what could have possibly happened that he would go without the dogs. What would he be doing that he doesn't have the dogs with him? If he's going for a hike, he would take the dogs. He's camped all his life, always. He's more at home in the bush. Now that the weather's changed, it's cold, it's raining, and it's kind of scary now. It's hard to be positive now. Days after Ray vanished, the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse. meaning that hopes of finding him safe had dwindled. The authorities stated that at the time, he may have gone out to practice his aim, became injured in the process, and was now unable to communicate with them. It really does seem like they weren't being completely open about it because they were sending in fully armed squads. Their hypothesis quickly shifted though. A man who went missing while camping near Harrison Lake is presumed to have drowned, and the focus of the search efforts has shifted from rescue to recovery. For context, the search and rescue professionals had now entered the search and began their grid searches. But I believe that they were told not to go too far into the bush, which again they found odd. By means of an aerial search, Ray's clothing and belongings were spotted at a beach, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police went in to retrieve them. Upon their return, they had the items, but apparently told the searchers that it was not worth going in any further as it's unsearchable. This left searchers puzzled again, because it seems that they knew that wasn't completely true. It's not clear to me now, or obviously the searchers back then, what the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's motivations were with that instruction. In the afternoon of June 13, RCMP Air Services saw balloons at a secluded beach approximately 400 metres north of his campsite. Ground teams found clothing and spent shell casings. Their conclusion was that Ray may have been hurt, but because of cliffs and rocky outcrops, couldn't get off the beach. They theorise he ejected shells trying to get someone's attention. At someone's car, really? For additional context, the helicopter spotted Ray's backpack, some clothes folded beneath a log, and his hunting equipment. Quite a distance away from this area, and sometime at a later date, I believe, his sidearm would be found laying in a meadow. Clearly, something odd happened there. Why was the sidearm so far away from everything else, on top of a hill first of all? And secondly, despite the unusualness, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police doubled down, saying that they feel that he must have been in the water. His boat was still at the campsite, so it's not as if he'd had some kind of boating accident. And even if he'd been on the boat, his wife said that he never does so without having the life jacket on. Official conclusions seem to allude to the idea that Ray became injured and entered the water for some reason, and while trying to swim back to camp, he must have gone beneath the water and thereby passed away at some stage. It's important to note that the clothing was found 2 days into the search, and it was fairly warm at that point apparently, even at higher elevations, so it certainly seems that at that point in time, hypothermia was just completely out of the question and not a plausible reason for the removal of his clothing. A few other points of oddity. There was a large tracking dog presence, and the handlers had said that it was very unusual to find absolutely no trace at all, despite having so many of them out looking. According to Daniela, the items found and retrieved by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were never returned to the family. I don't really understand that, especially when it comes to the backpack. That seems like it should have been returned by default. So again, what was the motivation in keeping it for themselves? The whole situation reeks from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's perspective. It reeks of them holding some kind of an inclination or knowledge that they just didn't want to share. Was the backpack considered evidence then? And if so, evidence of what? In the end, it also seems like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police changed their stance on the headlights situation too. The Mounties believed Ray drowned sometime after going on a hike high up in the bush above his campsite and injuring himself. Somehow, the mishap left him trapped on a small beach wedged along the shore's steep terrain. Unable to climb out, he took off his boots, socks and pants and likely tried to swim around a rocky bluff to another clearing but slipped under the surface. There very well may have been a fall of some kind, but I agree with the assessment by Daniela that if he was hiking, then the dogs would have been with him. So if he did feel the need to get to higher ground, just what was going on? Whether he fell off a cliff or climbed down, we don't know, said a Royal Canadian Mounted Police corporal. Before Ray entered the water, police believe he was in such distress that he ejected 6 shells. His younger brother, Bob, a fellow hunter, said it was common for salmon to carry in the wilderness in case of a run-in with a bear or another wild animal. One of the 6 smashed the headlights of a Nissan Pathfinder, some 500 metres away and directly in sight of the small beach. Another 2 struck the side of a camper in a neighbour's campsite. So at this point, that and the disappearance itself were now being viewed as connected. Though police ruled out foul play, Ray's brother and Otto, who also visited the campsite Saturday, mulled over other scenarios when they received the news. Ray has run into some strange people here, said Otto, before Bob picked up the story. Yeah, Bob said. A few years ago, some armed people were up here and they threatened to take his boat and everything. He ended up staying in the bush all night with the means of defending himself. If Ray had been injured by another person, it seems that you might have expected to see evidence of that near to where his items were found. Though in that scenario, I suppose Ray entering the water also might have made sense if he felt that it was his only means of escape. Though on that point, it is important to note that the lake had been searched many times without finding him, including the use of robotic submersibles. For me, the key lies in the fact that Ray locked the dogs inside the camper, and that his sidearm had just been dropped and abandoned on the top of a hill. I personally believe he locked those dogs away for good reason, though I don't know what that reason was. It just seems to me that an event completely out of his control took place that night. Now, what that event might have been, I have no idea. Despite 10 years passing now, Ray has never been found. Thomas Messick Sr. was 82 years old when he went missing on the 15th of November 2015. The disappearance of this seasoned hunter in the dense wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains in the state of New York has baffled search and rescue professionals and investigators alike. Tom was an ex-paratrooper and an experienced outdoorsman who walked into the woods south of Brant Lake near Lily Pond with 6 of his friends and family members. They set out to pursue deer and bring back the spoils, but during this outing, he would never be seen again. Tom had always been known as a highly competent man that had a lot of practical skills in life, not just in the outdoors, but was something of a handyman too. His loved ones described him as a fiercely independent person who was loved and popular in the community. It seems that he was a very friendly and a well-liked person all round. Calling Tom a seasoned hunter isn't overselling his abilities either. He'd been doing this for many long years and had taught his 3 sons how to do it. He'd also help and teach others how to navigate and hunt successfully in wilderness areas in order to help them get their license. All in all, those nearest to him said that he was unbelievably good in the woods. With that being said though, in his older age, he wasn't without problems anymore. Tom sadly had an accident years prior that made him blind in one eye, and his eyesight in general wasn't so great anymore anyway. It was a similar story with his hearing too, and based on what I can find online, I believed he required hearing aids at this stage. Moving to the day in question, he and his 6 companions, comprised of friends and family, set out towards Brant Lake for the first time. They all had walkie-talkies, but had never hunted in this area before now, and he, along with the other 3 older members of the group, set up shop at the bottom of a hill. Their role was to be what's known as a watcher. They are stationary, and the plan was that the 3 younger members of the group were to go around the hill before coming back up over and down the hill towards the watchers. The idea was to push any deer they could find down the hill towards the watchers, who would then bring the hunt to a close. They initiated this plan at 12 PM. Strangely, on this day, there were no deer in the area. In fact, according to those present in the group, they never saw any wildlife at all, which was described as odd, not only by the group, but by other personnel who would later be involved in the search and investigation. This is one element of the situation as a whole that many believe makes the disappearance just that much more odd, because there was perhaps this element of unusualness to the area. Now, the 4 watchers were said to be spaced apart somewhere roughly between 150 to 200 yards from one another at the bottom of this hill. The area was forested, so I don't believe that they were able to see one another, and each of them took the role as watcher seriously, as they are an integral part to the whole process. Without them, the whole plan would have just fallen apart. Tom's family, present and otherwise, as well as his friends, stated very clearly that he would not just have up and left his post. Yet, when the three younger members arrived at the bottom of the hill, without being able to find and head any deer at all, they made their way towards the watcher's general position and over the walkie-talkies stated that they'd had no luck and it was time to meet back up where they'd parked the vehicles. At 2 PM, everyone began to make their way there and they all met up again at the trucks, all that is, except for Tom. What's weird about this is that Tom never used his radio to signal for help or anything to that effect. As the remaining 6 waited patiently at the trucks, they quickly realised that something was wrong. The 3 older members, I believe, stayed by the trucks while the other 3 re-entered the forest in the direction of Tom's watch position. They went right to that exact spot where Tom was stationed and saw nothing. He wasn't there, and there wasn't any kind of an indication as to where he might have gone. Just for the sake of clarity, all of his equipment was gone too. Everyone was dumbfounded, as they didn't believe that he would have just gotten lost, and from what I can tell, this had never happened before. There was no evidence of animal predation or some kind of attack. Everyone split up, and one of the men at the trucks drove their way out of the area to call for help, which was achieved at 4:30 PM. Meanwhile, the men inside the forest were trying to make as much noise as possible to get Tom's attention. They called for him. They ejected shells towards the sky to help Tom locate them, but none of it worked. They never saw or heard anything. This search went on for 4 hours until darkness began to fall and last light came at around 7:30 PM. It was at this point that they realised they needed to change strategy, and instead they got in their trucks and began to drive up and down the roads with their high beams on while honking the horn. They fully believed that they were going to find him. They just assumed now that he must have wandered off in the wrong direction. As the professional search and rescue members arrived, their effort began, and as more and more time went on, things began to look bleak, and no one had any idea as to what happened to him. Search dog teams were going in from all different positions. They went right up to his exact last known position where he was sat waiting for the deer. The dogs couldn't find a scent leading out of there. To everyone searching, this didn't make sense. The whole forest area, including areas that were further out, were grid searched extensively over and over again without producing a single result. It was almost as if he'd vanished exactly from the spot he was sitting down and left absolutely no trace behind at all. As said, there were no signs of animal predation, and Tom was getting on in life now, so it's not like he could walk any kind of extreme distance at this point in his life. How, in this situation, was it that he was able to evade hundreds of searchers? It almost doesn't even seem feasible, yet there everyone was, completely unable to find even a hint of him. There was another oddity to this whole incident too, in addition to the complete lack of animals in the area. As the 3 younger members were making their way around and up the backside of the hill, another watcher who was waiting at the bottom of said hill stated that he heard something weird. He said that he heard a sound that he found difficult to describe. He said that it was completely out of place in the woods and he hadn't heard anything quite like it before while out in the wilderness. He said that this sound was quick, it didn't linger and wasn't present for long at all. This man believes that the sound emanated from the direction of the hill that the other 3 younger members were to ascend. He stated that if he had to guess, it originated around 150 yards away in the direction of the hill, which of course would also be 150 yards or so away from all of the other watchers, roughly in the direction that they were all facing. While trying to describe the sound, it was stated as being like a snap or crack sound, somewhat like a big trap closing or something similar. Sadly, I couldn't find any further extrapolation or description of this sound, but what is interesting is that Under Sheriff Sean Lamore, who was present during this ordeal, also stated that the whole area seemed to be devoid of any wildlife, and he too said that was very odd. One can only assume then that presumably means that wasn't typical or to be expected in this area. State Forest Rangers and volunteer searchers returned Tuesday to deep woods around Lily Pond to resume the search for Tom. Volunteers worked with rangers but found no clues as to his whereabouts as of late Tuesday afternoon. Search leaders estimated 130 or so people were involved in the initial search. The area being searched is remote, big country. There are miles of trails and very little in the way of civilization between Brant Lake and Lake George. Ranger and state troopers, aided by dogs and a state police helicopter, have searched since the day of the disappearance to no avail. This is interesting right off the get-go because Tom was wearing camouflage clothing, which the search leaders took note of and said that it would likely be difficult to see him. One might assume then that is why they brought in a large search dog presence immediately, because while camouflage might make it more difficult to see him, it wouldn't interfere with the ability of the dogs to use scent to sniff him out from wherever he was. However, and as was said earlier, to everyone's surprise, the dogs simply could not find a scent anywhere in the immediate area of Tom's disappearance. It seems as though there was just nothing for them to follow. They searched and researched the same area leading away from his last known position in all directions in a grid-like manner, and they only fanned out from there, covering further ground. Searchers said that they had to wade through some particularly harsh terrain. They went through swamps that would reach up to their chests, but even so, he just wasn't to be found in any of these more harsh areas either. It seems that his family didn't believe that Tom would have entered these areas in the first place because, as said earlier, and despite his age, Tom was actually very good in these kinds of areas. His family stated that his general common sense was very good, and had he have been in any kind of trouble, he would have tried to reach his companions, one through means of the walkie-talkie, or two by ejecting shells towards the sky, as the other men tried to do initially to help guide Tom back to them. None of this happened though. It seems as though Tom never used the radio, or at least none of the men ever heard from him, and they never heard the latter either. 4 days into the search, a couple of FBI tactical officers arrived at the scene of the disappearance, who stated that they were there to provide some or other kind of technological support. There was a lot of confusion surrounding their presence because they generally do not involve themselves in a missing persons case unless there is evidence to suggest that a crime has been committed. Though I do believe that there is more leeway when it comes to a missing young person. I actually found some direct quotes on this from a former FBI agent of 26 years named Jerry Williams. Here's what she had to say. "Just because an adult has gone missing doesn't make it a crime that requires a response from law enforcement. People are allowed to just walk away from their former lives to start a new life without telling anyone of their plans. However, if there is evidence that indicates their disappearance may have been the result of foul play, a missing persons case will be initiated by law enforcement. The FBI will officially open and lead a missing person investigation when 1. Foul play is suspected and the person's last known whereabouts was on federal property, or 2. The missing person is a US official, elected or otherwise appointed. Most often, the FBI's participation in a missing person case is based on a request for assistance from local law enforcement or the state, among others. This is interesting because Jerry says specifically that foul play must be suspected for them to get involved, and 2. That their participation is usually based on a request from those already investigating, essentially. In this instance, there was absolutely no evidence left behind whatsoever to suggest any form of criminality had taken place. I also couldn't find anything to confirm that their presence had been requested. So, why were they there? Tom's wife said that these agents told her that they felt that something was definitely not right about this disappearance. It's not clear to me exactly what they meant by that, They followed up with her by saying that they wouldn't know what was not right about it until a body was located. I can see what they're getting at though. You have an elderly man that shouldn't have been able to get very far, and yet he somehow managed to disappear so thoroughly that the dogs, nor thermal imaging equipped helicopters could even find a hint of him. Thus, I suppose you can only reason that may be precisely why they showed up to investigate. You have an incident that makes no sense whatsoever. You have this elderly man that had vanished without a trace and nothing was being uncovered. Searchers did expect to find at least a trace of him. They stated that animals generally do not touch or move the equipment that he was carrying, and those items wouldn't have degraded over time. Perhaps these odd elements of the disappearance led them to believe or suspect that Tom had been taken by some kind of third party. How on earth this would have looked in the middle of the woods, I have absolutely no idea. I obviously agree with the investigators' assessment that animal predation had not occurred in this situation. There would have been signs all over the place had that been the case. There was no disturbed ground, no drag marks, no shredded clothing or anything else. It was as if he'd been taken from that spot. If a third party taking Tom was in fact the running private hypothesis or suspicion, it seems to me that something must have happened when the younger three were ascending the hill. It must have happened before the entire group made radio contact with one another, because as far as I can tell, no one at any stage heard from Tom. So it seems to me at least, Tom had already vanished somehow before the group had made their way down the hill. It seems that had he have just wandered away, firstly, there would have been some radio contact, or he'd have used his equipment as a means of getting people's attention. And secondly, I firmly believe that this search effort would have uncovered him had that have been the case. So the ultimate question then is, I suppose, were the FBI fully aware that the circumstances did not make sense and that there was an air of unusualness to this whole case? Is that why they were there? If that is the case, that means that to some degree, they may very well be aware of some of the more unusual disappearances that have been covered over the years. Or they actually did just suspect foul play, but never really made that explicitly clear for whatever reasons they had. State Forest Rangers, State Police, Warren County Sheriff's Office personnel, State Conservation Officers, volunteers and FBI tactical officers spent a fourth day searching for Tom but found no clues as to his location. They planned to go until dark Wednesday and resume Thursday despite a rainy forecast. David Winchell, a spokesman for the State Department of Environmental Conservation, said the searchers expanded the area that was being searched Wednesday to include area they had not looked over earlier in the week. These areas were further out and they didn't actually believe Tom could have made it there, but because they had already scoured the area extensively at this point, it seems to me that they were running out of options and had to try something, anything. The weather actually quite suddenly became worse 2 days prior on the second day of the search, and everyone involved had to endure quite heavy rains beating down on them as they looked for him. This of course slows down the search effort in general, makes it more difficult, and it obviously becomes more dangerous too. At some point in the search, I'm not quite sure when, but people were said to be dumbfounded by the set of circumstances that they were presented with, and questioned whether Tom might have gotten out of the woods, arrived at a road, and then perhaps may have been involved in an accident. All of the roads, which each were quite the trek from Tom's last known position, were searched, and still there was nothing to suggest this outcome. Searchers then said that they'd covered almost every inch of ground, standing almost shoulder to shoulder while walking in large lines throughout the grid layout of the forest, and Tom was just not present. During this time, divers also entered Lily Pond, all nearby streams and swamps, and still never found anything. This search was massive. It included hundreds of people from over 60 jurisdictions who all wanted to help. Experienced search dog teams were provided from all over the place, and as mentioned already, helicopters had been overhead the entire time. Sean Lamore noted that the whole ordeal was odd because you'd think that they would have found some trace of him, but as we've been over, this didn't happen. I found this quote, which shares a similar thought to the one I expressed earlier. Messick's disappearance has confounded searchers who can't figure out how a man with extensive health problems could have gotten far enough or gotten to a secluded enough spot to have not been found by dozens of trained searchers for nearly a week at this point. It's important to say also that locals, searchers, Tom's friends, family and companions that day all expressed how odd this situation was, which I thought spoke volumes about this particular disappearance. No one seemed to have any great hypotheses, including the FBI agents who told Tom's wife only that they felt something was definitely not right. I know that some may feel that because of all the circumstances we've discussed so far, that the companions he was with must have had something to do with it, but there was just no evidence in support of that. The group Messick was with have been assisting with the search every day, Simpson said. They were questioned by state police the day after Messick was reported missing, and investigators said there is no indication of foul play. The men had been together from a camp near Hague, but had not been around Lily Pond before. I personally do not believe that his companions had anything to do with his disappearance. The official search for Tom ended on the 26th of November 2015, 11 days after he vanished. But volunteers did continue after this time until it was realised by more and more people that he was just not going to be found. Though I believe that a small handful of people did search every so often through the years and still never found anything. Forest Ranger Rick Schroeder said, "We thought we'd find him that night, and if not that night, the next day." Rangers with global positioning satellite receivers went through shoulder to shoulder. They checked woods, thick brush, sides of mountains, swamps and ponds to no avail. An area of 8,000 acres had been searched, and more than 2 weeks later, not a clue as to where Messick went has been located. Schroeder said, "We're going to maintain a presence there. It's baffling. We won't know what happened until we find him." 2 months after Tom vanished, searchers are no closer to determining where he went. And a family member said that they have no theories of what could have happened to him. David Winchell said, "There's nothing new, our guys are stumped." Tom's son, Thomas Messick Jr., said that the family has no idea what could have happened. The State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation looked into the companions early on and concluded nothing was amiss. The investigators who interviewed the witnesses know their stuff, and if there had been anything strange there, I'm confident they would have sniffed it out. Finally, there was a relatively popular sinkhole hypothesis that spread in relation to this disappearance. Water running underground can cause erosion, which can result in a sinkhole. The idea goes that one must have formed over time in his general vicinity. He'd unknowingly applied his weight to it, which caused it to collapse and swallow him, which would then have been quickly covered by earth. The response to this idea generally seems to be that evidence of such a sinkhole would have been found given how extensively the area was searched, especially the point from which Tom was sitting. I don't know enough about sinkholes to make any relevant comments about that other than sharing the general gist of that little back and forth. Ultimately for me, I think the key lies in the fact that there was an FBI presence to a disappearance in the woods in which there was absolutely no sign or evidence of foul play at all. Either they were in possession of further evidence or information that was just never shared publicly which pointed in the direction of foul play, or there was another reason they were there. Interestingly, if there was information that they were privy to, it doesn't seem like they made the sheriff's office aware, only stating that they were there to provide technological support. That's the real oddity to me, especially when you pair it with the other, somewhat ominous factors. Why was there a total lack of wildlife in the area at the time, which was reported by numerous sources who were in the area? That being, the actual group of 7, or now 6, that came back. And the undersheriff also made a note of that later. And this odd, quick noise that was heard, what was that? It was said to be completely out of place. Was there a link between the source of this noise and the lack of an animal presence? It's understandable why there might have been a lack of wildlife during the search. I imagine a large presence of people would scare them away. but I'm not sure why beforehand. Perhaps there were other groups out also on the day of or before the disappearance that were loud and scared a lot of the wildlife away. I've no idea. Anyway, I've reached a point now where I'm just speculating, and it seems that I've exhausted most of the information in regards to Tom and the disappearance. From the banks of a murky river to the placid waters of a shallow pond and down the winding course of a canal, each waterway has been the silent witness to an unusual disappearance. Let's begin in the UK with the disappearance of Suvik Paul, who was 19 years old when he vanished while out on a New Year's Eve night in 2012 with a group of his friends in Manchester. Suvik was a bright young man studying product design at the Manchester University. According to his friends and roommates, he was easy to get along with and always up for a laugh, which made him quite popular at the university. Going on that night out was actually a brand new experience for Suvik. One of his new friends from the uni, Charlotte, said that she was worried about him attending as he'd arrived from India and had never been on a night out like this before. Her worries were probably justified too, because the venue they were attending is quite intimidating in some regards. It's very large and gets busy. As I'm sure many have experienced here, at some point during the night in such places, it can become quite easy to either get separated or to lose track of others. Regardless though, Suvik was said to be enthusiastic about that night and was very much looking forward to it. Unfortunately though, he would make some highly questionable decisions that night. The venue in question was called the Warehouse Project, located here. In the hours leading up to the disappearance, Suvik and his friends had been drinking, and apparently Suvik had taken another substance also. According to his friends, he had researched how to hide these capsules from the club's sniffer dogs and get them inside by hiding them in his clothing. This, as it turns out, was not a good idea given what ended up happening that night. Because of the busy nature of this club, the staff created a one-way system to help people navigate the place without getting in each other's way. I'm sure that you can imagine the kind of problems that can arise when everyone's drinking at the very least and bumping into one another. In any case, at some point during the night, Suvik became separated from his friends, and I believe he became quite belligerent as he charged at a member of the security staff in order to get past the one-way system. I believe he was also trying to jump the queue to the toilet, which would result in Suvik being thrown out at 10:55 PM that night. He would be seen 5 minutes later at 11 PM on CCTV outside the building. Then again, a short time later on another camera. Suvik was trying to climb over a fence to get back to the club, and two of the men were heading down an embankment to the canal. This would be the very last time Suvik would ever be seen again. He did try to text his friends to tell them what had happened, but because the phone lines were so busy, they only got through the following day. He was also reported missing on the first day of 2013 by his roommate, who had attempted to make contact with Suvik, but each attempt went unanswered. A major search was initiated by the authorities to locate him, but these efforts led nowhere. All of the CCTV footage was analysed, and it was determined that Suvik climbing the fence was the very last time he was captured. Interestingly, search dogs could not find a scent. Okay, let's get bizarre now. This search went on for around 3 weeks, and on the 22nd day, Suvik's body was found in an area that was searched repeatedly in the Bridgewater Canal, just 50 feet away from the nightclub and his original point of disappearance. How the body had been missed so many times despite being so close is not clear. Even the coroner's report was strange. Pathologist Naomi Carter concluded that the cause of passing was drowning and that there were not marks to Suvik's clothing and no physical injuries. Recording an open verdict, Coroner Joanne Kersley said that although the substances were likely to have contributed to his behaviour, they were not the cause of his passing. She said, despite extensive investigation, it cannot be ascertained where or how he entered the water. If you've watched my previous video, this is all sounding somewhat reminiscent of David Plunkett's disappearance, isn't it? If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link to it in the description and in the top right corner of this video now if you wish to open a new tab. It's not sequential, you can watch these videos in either order. Now, as explained, Suvik had sustained no injuries whatsoever and an open verdict was recorded. We can glean a couple of things from this. For those that don't know, an open verdict is the coroner's way of saying that the occurrence is perhaps suspicious, and there is insufficient evidence to definitively determine the cause. It's essentially an acknowledgement that the passing has not been explained or is uncertain after all of the available evidence has been taken into account and considered. The recording of an open verdict is very strange in this case because you'll note that the pathologist, on the other hand, stated that it was a clear-cut case of drowning. Either there was water in the lungs or there was not. That seems like a very odd back and forth there. If this was a clear-cut case of drowning, you think that would have been confirmed by the coroner. From an initial glance, it seems like two conflicting pieces of information. However, I did a bit of reading around the idea of a pathologist and coroner perhaps concluding differently, and here's a relevant quote that I came across. Sometimes, even if the physical evidence points towards a specific cause of passing, there might be too many unanswered questions about the circumstances leading up to that cause. For example, if someone were determined to have drowned, but it's unclear how they ended up in the water, the coroner might opt for an open verdict. That wasn't specifically in regards to this case, but that at least makes some sense. So in essence, the coroner could also have determined that he did drown, but because there's so many unanswered questions otherwise, specifically in terms of the fact that the authorities had absolutely no idea how or where he'd ended up in the water, the coroner opted for an open verdict. So it's not necessarily a disagreement between the pathologist and coroner, though it's still out of the ordinary. The amount of time the body had been in the water had also not been specified. This is important also because based on where he was found, it's not even clear to me that he'd been in the water for the entire 22-day duration. It's odd that you'd be found 50 feet away from the point at which you'd vanished, despite that very area being under a constant search. Because of the uncertainties and unusualness of this case, Suvik's father said that he believed that there must have been the involvement of a third party. I must admit, I find myself in agreement with him. There's something abnormal about this entire situation, which former detective Chief Superintendent Tony Blockley also noted. Tony made an astute observation. He detailed that the 6-foot fence in question that Suvik apparently tried to climb over means that for some unknown reason, Suvik had crossed a bridge over a canal, then travelled down the far side to try to climb over the fence that was on the opposite side of the canal to the nightclub. This was highly unusual and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The argument cannot be that Suvik had planned to climb over the fence, jump into the water, and then swim back down to the club where he'd have been soaking wet. Unless, of course, he was completely out of his mind at that point. But given that the authorities had absolutely no idea where he entered the water to have been found where he was, it perhaps seems unlikely that he entered the water there. We're in speculation territory now, but could Suvik have been attempting to escape from a perceived threat? That at least makes more sense than climbing over a fence randomly on the other side of the water to the club. That literally does not even make sense to suggest that that was an attempt to get back into the club. It just seems that somehow there's more to this incident than meets the eye. This incident, alongside David Plunkett's and others from this area, have led to speculations that a certain unknown third party has been the cause of this and is pushing people in. In 2001, Manchester'sFinest.com reported, "Since 2007, authorities have pulled 77 bodies out of Manchester's canal and waterway network, many of which are young men. Are these a series of unrelated accidents, or is there something more to this?" Professor Craig Jackson said that it was unlikely that such a high number of cases are the result of just accidents. Law enforcement in turn stated that there is no evidence to support this, and that if someone was actively pushing people into the canal, the pusher could not be certain that this would even cause someone to pass away. Detective Chief Superintendent Russ Jackson of Greater Manchester has said that there is no evidence that an individual is stalking the city's canals. What is very important to bear in mind in all these cases is that they have been subject to separate investigations, and there is no evidence at all to suggest that they are linked or were suspicious. While in some cases it remains uncertain how people came to be in the water, just like Suvik. Something to note is that none of the missing had ever been caught on CCTV being pushed into the water, and the UK is one of the most surveilled countries in the world. So if there is someone pushing people in, it means that he, or they if a group, have to be extremely knowledgeable of where all the cameras are. If that is the case, that sounds like a very well put together and detailed operation. Also arguably making that less likely. The inquest heard that there was not an explanation as to how and where he entered the water. Over 10 years have passed since this incident, and the circumstances are unlikely to ever be explained now. We'll come back to the UK, but first let's visit the United States of America. Jelani Brinson was 24 years old at the time of his disappearance when he vanished from Anoka in the state of Minnesota. Jelani seemed to have been quite a successful man, as he'd started a family and had an unborn son. At the time, he'd also recently been promoted at his job too. I'm not sure if he was celebrating specifically on the day that he went missing, but he certainly had a lot to look forward to. Sometime on the evening of the 17th of April 2009, Jelani would make a phone call to his mother, who was at the Mad Jack Sports Cafe at Brooklyn Park. But this call went unanswered, as she never heard it over the crowded restaurant. Jelani would disappear not too long after this call was made. That evening, he was with his friends, who out of sheer coincidence later recalled that they, alongside Jelani, were also in Mad Jack's that night, and he actually probably made that call to his mother from inside the restaurant while they were both present. The pair sadly never bumped into one another. Once Jelani and his friends were done at Mad Jack's, they left to visit the home of a fellow co-worker of his who lived on Kennedy Street, and they arrived at about 10 PM. Most sources indicate that 5 minutes after arriving, Jelani stepped outside to smoke, and minutes later the others came out to do the same. Things take a bizarre turn now, because as the others came outside, his friend stated that he began to display unusual behaviour, in the sense that, and I quote, Jelani put his head down and left. The reasons as to why he did that were not clear to anyone. They weren't sure why this had just happened or what went on that caused him to leave. It seems that they didn't know if he was just messing around or what, but they went out into the neighbourhood to look for him, but they couldn't find him. 55 minutes later, at 11 PM, a call was made from Jelani's phone, but to whom was never made available to the public. Things immediately get a little bit suspect here to me, because after he ran away, the friends didn't report this to the emergency services or anything. It seems as though they had a little look around for him, couldn't find him, and assumed that he would just be okay and would get home fine. I'm not actually sure what was going through their minds at that point. Perhaps whatever it was they were smoking wasn't something they wished others, especially law enforcement, to know about, and so didn't want to call it in, but that is total speculation on my part. I'm not sure why else you wouldn't report it in, though I suppose it must have been somewhat confusing if he literally just bolted out of nowhere for reasons you couldn't ascertain. The following day, he didn't show up to work and was absent from a visit he was supposed to make, and I believe one of these incidents was the spark that made its way to his mother, which is when she realised that something was wrong. Alice, Jelani's mother, an emergency room nurse, called police late Saturday afternoon after her son missed work and failed to visit his daughter. He also had not picked up his car. She told the media, "I keep calling his phone to see if someone might answer, but it just goes into voicemail. I don't know what to think, but I don't think it's good." Over 50 search and rescue personnel with search dogs arrived on Kennedy Street on the 19th and began looking. Not long after the search began, searchers found one of his shoes and his hat in a neighbour's garden right next to some railroad tracks. I believe that this property was right across the street from the friend's house. Soon after, they found his other shoe south of the tracks in an industrial area. This, for some reason, led authorities to speculate about the possibility that he might have somehow managed to get onto a slow-moving train for some reason. It's not really clear why they went straight to that. It seems very random and arbitrary to me, but Jelani's girlfriend said that would have been completely out of character for him to have just absconded and left like that without saying anything. Perhaps there was a realization behind the scenes just how odd it was that they'd found the shoes and no other clues at all, and so they were just trying to jump to the first thing that could technically make sense. In any case, it seems that at some point they came to their senses and abandoned that line of thought. Without some kind of external factor or influence, I can't think of a single reason aside from some kind of medical incident as to why he would just leave abruptly and then abandon his shoes. Let's be clear, he was outside for 5 minutes, so this had nothing to do with hypothermia. Again, this is speculation, but if the group had taken a substance that they shouldn't have, there is the potential that Jelani could have had a bad reaction to it. Also, just to clarify that we are actually in speculation land, police said that Jelani had a clean record and that there was no immediate sign that any substances or drinking were a factor in the disappearance. So, from law enforcement's perspective, I can only imagine they questioned the friends and had their investigation into that night, but came to the conclusion that those things weren't a factor at all. Given that, I'd love to hear some opinions as to what else could have caused him to ditch his shoes. One way or another, it sounds like once you ditch them, generally speaking, you're not going to be getting very far, so where did he go? Search dogs tracked Jelani's scent from near his friend's home in Anoka to an area about 1.5 miles west. The scent trail ended about 100 yards behind the outpost bar. His family viewed the bar's security tapes but didn't see him, Police Chief Phil Johansson said. This is quite unusual because we know based off the items found, in theory we know where he'd been, so the dog should have gone from point A to point B to C, etc. until we got to him. This of course did not happen, and the dogs went straight west as said behind the outpost bar. It's interesting that he wasn't spotted on CCTV, and presumably if he was even there, he'd gone all that way barefoot. Was he alone? There's a huge, obvious question mark in regards to that time period where absolutely nothing is really known. Speaking of which, let's get bizarre, because while things already didn't make any sense, they're about to make even less. The search had been ongoing for a week and found absolutely nothing other than the shoes and hat. Now, on that 7th day, the 25th of April 2009 at 1 in the afternoon, an employee at the Greenhaven golf course noticed something unusual floating in a 3-foot deep pond. The employee had discovered Jelani floating face up, and weirdly, this was only 1,500 feet away from the friend's house. The location is about 1,500 feet from where Jelani was last seen, across the street and over some railroad tracks from the home on Kennedy Street. Jelani's body did not have shoes on, yet the socks were clean. Investigators say this means he didn't walk into the pond on his own, he was placed there. When law enforcement came to investigate the pond, initially it was felt that this whole thing was just an unfortunate accident, but soon certain details were realised that made things very unclear. It was found that Jelani had only passed away a few days prior at most, but he'd been missing for the entire week. It was this fact, coupled with the fact that he had clean socks, that made the authorities believe that his body was somehow placed in the pond, but they had no idea how that came to be. There were no obvious footprints indicating he'd walked to the pond, or had been dragged or carried by someone else, and there were no tyre marks or anything of that nature, so it's not as if someone had driven up close to the pond. Also, the search dogs never tracked his scent to this body of water. How does one just get into a pond like this without leaving behind any kind of trace as to what happened? The Anoka County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy and reported that the cause of passing was inconclusive. No marks or signs of injury or foul play were found during the examination, and there were no substances in his system. Anatomical causes such as a heart attack or a brain aneurysm and even drowning was ruled out. The autopsy revealed that Jelani passed away before he entered the water. There was no water in his lungs, so what even happened here? Initially, you'd be forgiven if you thought that something like perhaps a disoriented Jelani wandered away and some kind of robbery or altercation or something along those lines occurred and went awry. But that almost certainly wasn't the case, as his wallet with money was found on the body and he'd sustained no injuries. The sheriff's lieutenant, Paul Sommer, expanded on this point and said that there were no signs of an altercation at either of the locations where the shoes and hat were found. He also said that the friends he was with that night had cooperated completely. The authorities almost certainly, privately at the very least, had to suspect that the friends had done something. But it also appears that there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest any wrongdoing by them. If there were no signs of a struggle, does this mean that he just took them off voluntarily then? Because there were no signs of some kind of medical event or third-party interruption, there's just something so weird and wrong about this case to me. None of this is really making any sense at all. Paul Sommer stated this: "The coroner couldn't say why he passed away. That's what makes this investigation so difficult. It is particularly frustrating because normally in a situation like this, we expect certain things to be apparent. If he's found in a pond, you'd think he drowned. He did not. Or, if he was dumped there, you'd think you'd find an anatomical cause or substances. That was not there either. We have very little to go on." The sheriff's department stated that this was one of the most frustrating cases they'd ever been involved with, and said that the medical examiner's report just made it all the more confusing. Because of a very baffling lack of evidence to point towards anything, Detective Maggie Titus was brought in and stated this: "It's my job to make sure that I can get her an answer. I'm trying to give it a fresh set of eyes. In this 1500-foot area, what happened to Jelani? Was he being chased? Was he scared of something? His passing, to me, is very suspicious. As far as I know, he did not drown. We don't even really know what happened, but we know he didn't end up in that pond by himself." The toxicology report found high levels of GHB in his system. This is a substance that can be placed into a person's drink. That's not to say that's how he ingested it, but for one reason or another, there was a higher than normal presence of it in his body. Ingesting GHB can result in short-term confusion and disorientation. A high dose can lead to unconsciousness. If nothing else had actually gone down at the friend's house, could that have been an indicator that he was confused and disoriented? He was at Mad Jack's that night, could he have ingested it there? We also know that he passed away 2 days at most before he was found. So he was either alive or was being kept alive for 5 days prior. So there's also the possibility that during that time is when the GHB entered his system. The comments relayed by the public generally lean towards the idea that Jelani had run into foul play. But how do you come to terms with the fact that there was just no evidence of this at all? He hadn't been harmed and the coroner couldn't even determine how he passed away. I'm of the view that something very unusual happened to Jelani. I don't know exactly what I'm proposing, other than to say some kind of event took place that was completely out of his control. I don't know what it looked like or what it consisted of, but the facts as laid out do not gel well together at all. The fact that there was no water in the lungs is very strange, especially when coupled with the fact that he hadn't sustained injury either. I came across a lot of comments by the public that seemed to capture the way people felt and thought about this. I've paraphrased a couple of them to get to the gist of what they were saying, as they were quite long. Doesn't look like foul play was involved. So Jelani left the house, took off his shoes and hat by the railroad tracks, walked 1.5 miles in one direction, and then walked back 1.5 miles to go straight into the shallow golf course pond where he did not drown. Unlikely. There is something not right with this. Why in the world would a seemingly healthy, sane, athletic young 24-year-old go missing like this? We know that he didn't hop onto a slow-moving train, which was a silly suggestion in the first place. How can the suggestion be that he threw his shoes around, walked barefoot all that way to the bar, only to change his mind and go for a swim in the pond? Honestly, I believe that foul play took place that night. I think he tried to run up the tracks but was caught before he reached the bar, which is why the scent went no further. Also, these friends of his, why didn't they call the authorities when they couldn't find him? It's very suspicious. Over 14 years have passed since this incident took place, and nothing has ever been uncovered. Now, let's explore the final disappearance, which is shorter. On the 6th of December 2015, 20-year-old Jason Norfolk vanished during a night around the town with his girlfriend alongside some of their friends. In the early hours of the morning, Jason left the bar known as Rumours alone and vanished that night. His girlfriend stated that Jason just up and leaving by himself was unusual behaviour for him because typically their friend group would let everyone know that they were leaving before doing so. This particular bar was busy at the time, and no one had noticed that he left until some time after, when he couldn't be found inside the venue. According to the authorities, this picture, which isn't at all helpful, was captured by CCTV and shows the last people to see Jason before he disappeared. After he left the bar, Jason made his way towards the city centre, where 4 men briefly spoke to him and helped him out of a taxi someone else had ordered. It's thought that Jason may have had a minor altercation with these men before continuing on towards the town centre to find another taxi to get home. This behaviour was also said to be out of character for Jason, so it could point to the idea that he'd had too much to drink and was perhaps somewhat disoriented and confused. Jason was last seen on CCTV walking towards High Street in the city centre at 1:26 AM, and his precise movements thereafter were untraceable. Jason never made it home that night, and at 3:37 PM, 14 hours later, he was reported missing after failing to arrive home and no one being able to contact him through his phone. This is where things take a strange turn. During Jason's walk, he passed by the North Bridge, which allows travel over a small river, which it's believed he crossed. A large search effort of the river was undertaken by the authorities and many volunteers, which uncovered Jason's shoes in the mud besides the river. A few meters away from the shoes, his phone laid in the mud. Slightly further beyond, his trousers were found with his wallet still in the back pocket. Jason's body was never found. No explanation for the shoes and trousers being strewn around in the mud was ever really given, with the authorities simply stating that no foul play was suspected and that Jason must have just fallen into the river where he came to pass away. It's not clear what the family's opinion was, but Jason's mother did state this. Jason was a fit lad. He might have been able to climb out of the water. You have to wonder why his body hasn't been found. You wonder if the fact that he was only small and slim is the reason why he hasn't been found. All kinds of things run through your mind. It's clear to see why the authorities may have ruled out foul play. Because his wallet was still inside the trousers and was untampered with, that doesn't suggest a mugging. Based on comments surrounding this disappearance, a lot of people seem to get hung up on the fact that his shoes and trousers had been removed. And this is a good point. What exactly happened there? Could they have come off during the fall or a struggle in the water? Commenters also seem surprised that his body was said to have been washed away, but none of the other items had been. Based on the wording, it's not clear that the other items had been in the river itself, because it was stated that they were found in the mud besides the river. Though, given that the authorities stated that they believed he'd fallen in, I suppose they must have, otherwise that wouldn't make sense. Because then you have to argue that he removed them voluntarily, and I don't see a good explanation for that. Despite a large-scale search of the river, Jason's body wasn't found and has never been found since. Ultimately meaning that in the end, he'd vanished without a trace. What do you think happened here? Now, it's time to end this video and hand it over to you in the comments below. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.